The moment I stepped into the headquarters office and saw the old man from the harbor diner sitting calmly in the chair beside my commanding officer, wearing a perfectly pressed Marine Corps dress uniform with 4 silver stars on his shoulders, my first thought was simple. I must have walked into the wrong room. 4 stars. In the Marine Corps, that rank doesn't belong to ordinary officers. 4 stars belong to generals who command thousands of Marines, men whose decisions shape entire bases. And 2 weeks earlier, that same man had been sitting alone in a small roadside diner outside Norfolk, wearing a faded veteran cap, quietly trying to pay for a plate of eggs. At the time, nobody in that diner knew who he really was, including me. All I knew was that a Marine officer had just spoken to him in a way no veteran deserved, and I had stepped in. Looking back now, that small decision would lead me straight into the most uncomfortable meeting of my career. But to understand how any of that happened, you have to go back 2 weeks earlier, to a rainy Tuesday evening outside the Norfolk Marine Base. That day had been one of those long days every Marine knows too well. Inventory reports, equipment inspections, logistics paperwork that seemed to multiply every time you finished a page. By the time I finally signed out, the sky had already turned gray, the kind of dull coastal gray that means rain is coming soon. Sure enough, by the time I pulled past the base gate, a steady drizzle had already started. Not a heavy storm, just that constant Norfolk rain that makes the road shine under your headlights. I wasn't ready to go home yet. Some nights you just need a quiet place to sit before the day ends. There's a small diner about 10 minutes from base that a lot of service members stop at. Nothing fancy. The sign flickers sometimes. The coffee is strong enough to wake the dead, and the booths have cracked red vinyl that sticks to your uniform if you sit too long. But the place feels familiar, comfortable. I pulled into the parking lot beside a couple pickup trucks and an old sedan that looked like it had been there since the early 90s. Inside the diner smelled like bacon grease and fresh coffee. Only a handful of people were there. An older couple sharing pie, a truck driver reading a newspaper, 2 sailors arguing about football at the counter. I slid into a booth by the window. Linda, the waitress, had worked there for years and recognized most of the Marines who came through. "Long day?" she asked while pouring coffee. "Aren't they all?" I said. She smiled the way people do when they've heard that answer 1,000 times. I had just wrapped both hands around the warm mug when I noticed an older man standing near the register. He wore a faded Marine veteran cap. The brim had softened from years of use. Even with age bending his shoulders slightly, he still stood with the posture of someone who had spent a lifetime in uniform. Linda spoke to him quietly. At first, I didn't pay attention. Then I heard her say something that made me look up. "Sir, I'm sorry, it looks like the card didn't go through." The old man looked at the card for a moment. Not angry, not embarrassed, just thoughtful, like someone processing a small inconvenience. He tried the card again. The machine beeped. Linda shook her head gently. "I'm sorry, sir." The diner had grown just quiet enough for people to notice. The old man checked his wallet. Inside were only a few folded bills. Not enough. Before he could say anything else, a young Marine lieutenant sitting at the counter turned around. "You should probably check your wallet before ordering," he said sharply. The comment hung in the air. Unnecessary. The old man didn't argue. He simply nodded slightly. Well, these things happen. Something about that moment didn't sit right with me, so I stood up, walked to the counter, and placed my card down. "Put it on mine." The lieutenant looked annoyed. "You don't have to do that." I looked at him calmly. He's a Marine veteran. That was enough explanation for me. Linda ran the payment before anyone could argue. The old man studied me quietly. Up close, I could see the deep lines in his face, the kind carved by decades of sun, wind, and experience. "You a Marine?" he asked. "Yes, sir." He nodded slowly. "Well, thank you." His voice carried the quiet weight of someone who had spent years choosing words carefully. "It's nothing," I said. "Veterans look out for each other." For a moment, he simply watched me. Then he smiled slightly. Not a big smile, just enough to show appreciation. I picked up my coffee and headed for the door. Halfway there, he spoke again. "Marine." I turned. "Yes, sir?" "What's your name?" "Corporal Daniel Carter." He nodded once. "Good to meet you, Corporal Carter." Then I stepped back out into the rain. At the time, it felt like a small moment, just one Marine helping another. I drove home thinking about equipment reports and morning inspections, not about the quiet old veteran from the diner, and certainly not about how 2 weeks later I would walk into headquarters and see that same man wearing the uniform of a 4-star general. The next morning, the rain had cleared. Norfolk woke up to one of those cold coastal mornings where the wind seems determined to cut straight through your uniform. I arrived on base before sunrise, coffee in hand, joining the steady line of Marines walking through the gates. Morning formations always follow the same rhythm: boots hitting pavement, engines idling, orders moving down the chain of command. For most of us, the routine is automatic. You move through the morning without thinking. That morning started like any other, but it didn't stay that way for long, because that was the same week a new officer arrived at our unit, Major Andrew Collins. Every base has officers people talk about quietly, the kind of officer whose reputation travels ahead of him. Major Collins already had that reputation. Within days, the stories started spreading through the barracks in Motorpool. Career climber, obsessed with paperwork, more interested in reports than Marines. At first, I didn't pay much attention. Every command has rumors, and Marines learn quickly not to believe every story they hear. But within a week, it became obvious something was different. Major Collins ran the unit with rigid control. Every small mistake turned into a lecture, every delay became a written report. One afternoon, during a maintenance inspection, a young lance corporal misread a checklist line. Nothing dangerous, nothing unusual, the kind of mistake that normally gets corrected in seconds. Major Collins stopped the entire inspection. 20 Marines stood there in silence while he spent nearly 10 minutes tearing into the kid. "You represent the United States Marine Corps," he snapped. "Attention to detail is not optional." The lance corporal stood frozen, looking like he wished the concrete floor would open beneath him. Later that afternoon in the motor pool, Sergeant Ramirez shook his head. "That guy doesn't lead Marines," he muttered. "He manages paperwork." Nobody laughed, because everyone knew exactly what he meant. At first, Major Collins didn't seem to notice me much. I kept my head down, did my work, tried to stay out of the blast radius. But that changed about a week later. It started with something small, a supply inventory report. Routine paperwork. I had finished the report and submitted it through the chain of command like always. 2 days later, I was called in to Major Collins's office. If you've ever been summoned into an officer's office unexpectedly, you know the feeling. Your brain runs through every possible mistake you might have made, every missed detail, every report. I knocked on the door. "Enter." Major Collins sat behind his desk, perfectly composed. He held a copy of my report. "Corporal Carter," he said, "do you believe accuracy matters in this organization?" "Yes, sir." He slid the report across the desk. "There are discrepancies here." I looked down. A small numbering error on one equipment line. The kind of clerical mistake that normally takes 30 seconds to fix. "I can correct that immediately, sir." Major Collins leaned back in his chair. "That's not the point." And that's when I realized this wasn't about the report. It was about control. For the next 15 minutes, he lectured me about discipline, accuracy, and standards. His voice never rose, which somehow made it worse. Finally, he said something that made my stomach drop. "I'll be placing a note in your personnel record." For a small inventory typo. I left the office with the uncomfortable feeling that I had just stepped onto someone's radar. Over the next few days, things slowly got worse. Extra inspections, additional reports, assignments that somehow landed on my desk more than anyone else's. Nothing dramatic enough to complain about, but enough to wear a person down. One afternoon in the motor pool, Sergeant Ramirez pulled me aside. "You doing all right, Carter?" "Yes, Sergeant." He studied me for a moment. "You're on Collins' list." "What list?" "The Marines he thinks need extra supervision." I sighed. "Great." Ramirez shrugged. "Don't take it personally. He does this everywhere he goes." "Then why does command allow it?" Ramirez gave a dry laugh. "Because on paper, he looks perfect." That was the problem. Certain officers know exactly how far they can push things without crossing a line that gets them in trouble. Major Collins never yelled, never threatened anyone. He just documented everything. And paperwork can destroy a career faster than shouting ever could. By the end of the second week, tension around the unit had grown thick enough to feel. Marines were whispering about transfer requests. Another corporal had already been written up twice for things that used to be handled with a quick conversation. Then came the morning everything changed. It was a Thursday, cold, clear. I had just finished the morning equipment check when Sergeant Ramirez walked toward me. He had a look on his face I didn't like. "Carter." "Yes, Sergeant." "Headquarters just called." My stomach tightened. "What about?" "You're ordered to report." Those 3 words carry weight in the Marine Corps. Ordered to report. That means someone higher up wants to see you immediately. "Did they say why?" Ramirez shook his head. "No." And that was the worst answer possible. As I walked toward the administrative building, my mind ran through every report I had written, every inspection, every interaction with Major Collins. Had he escalated something? Filed a complaint? Career-ending paperwork often begins with a quiet meeting behind closed doors. The headquarters building stood near the center of the base. Brick walls, American flags snapping in the wind. Inside, the hallway smelled faintly of floor polish. The receptionist looked up as I walked in. "Corporal Carter?" "Yes, ma'am?" "Go right in." My boots echoed against the tile floor as I walked down the hallway. When I reached the doorknob, I paused for a moment. Then I knocked. "Enter." I stepped inside, and the first thing I saw was the old man from the diner. Except this time, he wasn't wearing a faded veteran cap. He was wearing a perfectly pressed Marine Corps uniform, and 4 silver stars rested calmly on his shoulders. When you're a corporal in the Marine Corps, walking into headquarters usually means one of 2 things. Someone important wants to congratulate you, or someone important is about to ruin your day. Standing there in that doorway, staring at the old man from the diner, now wearing 4 silver stars on his shoulders, I had absolutely no idea which one it was going to be. My commanding officer cleared his throat. "Corporal Carter, step in and close the door." I walked forward, trying very hard not to stare, but it was impossible not to notice the details. The uniform was immaculate. 4 silver stars rested on each shoulder. Rows of ribbons covered the left side of his chest. Even before anyone said his name, I understood one thing very clearly. This man wasn't just a general, he was one of the most senior officers in the entire Marine Corps, and 2 weeks earlier, I had bought him dinner at a roadside diner. I snapped to attention. "Corporal Daniel Carter reporting as ordered, sir." The general studied me for a moment. Then he smiled slightly. It was the same calm expression I remembered from the diner. "At ease, Corporal." His voice carried the quiet authority of someone who had spent decades giving orders. I relaxed slightly, though my heart was still beating faster than usual. My commanding officer gestured toward the chair across from the general. "Have a seat, Carter." That alone was unusual. Junior Marines don't normally sit during meetings with generals, but I followed the order. The general leaned back slightly in his chair. "Corporal Carter," he said, "do you recognize me?" There didn't seem to be any point pretending otherwise. "Yes, sir." He raised one eyebrow. "From where?" "The diner outside Norfolk, sir." A faint hint of amusement crossed his face. "That's correct." My commanding officer spoke next. "Corporal Carter, this is General Thomas Caldwell." The name hit me immediately. Caldwell was a legend in the Marine Corps.
Over 30 years of service, multiple deployments, the kind of officer whose leadership speeches get quoted in training manuals. And 2 weeks earlier, I had watched him struggle with a declined credit card. My brain was still trying to process the situation when the general spoke again. "You left rather quickly that night," he said. "Yes, sir." "Why?" The question caught me off guard. I shrugged slightly. He tapped the folder lightly. "I prefer to see how things operate when people don't know who I am." The realization started forming in my mind. The diner hadn't been an accident. It had been observation. "You were evaluating the base, sir?" "In a manner of speaking." He opened the folder. Inside were printed reports, unit evaluations, personnel records, and one page in particular made my stomach tighten. My name. "Corporal Carter," he said. "Are you familiar with Major Andrew Collins?" "Yes, sir." My commanding officer let out a slow breath. The general watched my reaction closely. "How would you describe your interactions with him?" That question carried weight. In the Marine Corps, criticizing an officer is never something you do lightly, especially not in front of a 4-star general. But General Caldwell's expression wasn't hostile. It was patient, like someone waiting for the truth. I chose my words carefully. "Professional, sir." The general smiled slightly. "That's a very diplomatic answer." My commanding officer spoke again. "Carter, this is an internal matter. Speak freely." I hesitated for a moment. Then I answered honestly. "Sir, Major Collins enforces administrative discipline very strictly." The general nodded. "Yes, I've read the reports." He slid a document across the desk. It was the disciplinary note Collins had placed in my record for the small inventory error. The general studied the paper for several seconds. Then he asked a simple question. "Do you believe this report accurately reflects your performance?" I swallowed. "No, sir." General Caldwell leaned back in his chair. "That's what I suspected." Outside the office window, Marines walked across the courtyard like any normal day, but inside the room, the atmosphere felt very different. Finally, the general closed the folder. "Corporal Carter," he said, "you're here today for 2 reasons." I waited. "First, I wanted to personally thank you for your kindness at the diner." I blinked. "Sir?" "You helped someone you believed was an elderly Marine veteran having difficulty." "Yes, sir." "And you did so quietly, without seeking recognition." "That seemed like the right thing to do, sir." The general nodded again. "That tells me a great deal about your character." Then his tone changed slightly. "But that is not the only reason you were here." My heart started beating faster again. The general turned toward my commanding officer. "Has Major Collins arrived?" "Any minute now, sir." The general folded his hands on the desk. "Good." Something about his expression had changed. It was still calm, still controlled, but now there was something else behind it. Resolve. And suddenly, I realized something important. This meeting had very little to do with a diner bill. A knock sounded at the door. My commanding officer called out, "Enter." The door opened. Major Andrew Collins stepped inside. He froze the moment he saw the general. His confident posture stiffened instantly. "Sir, I wasn't aware you were visiting today." General Caldwell didn't raise his voice. He simply looked at him. "Major Collins, please have a seat." And that was the moment I understood something clearly. This meeting had been planned very carefully, and someone in this room was about to have a very bad day.
Major Andrew Collins didn't sit down immediately. For a moment, he simply stood near the door, clearly trying to understand why he had just walked into a room with a 4-star general, his commanding officer, and one of his corporals sitting at the same table. The confidence he usually carried around the base had disappeared almost instantly. "Sir," Collins said, snapping to attention, "I wasn't informed you were visiting today." General Caldwell didn't answer right away. He simply studied the major for a few seconds, the way senior officers sometimes observe a situation before speaking. "Major Collins," he said calmly, "please close the door." Collins turned, shut the door, and slowly walked toward the chair. He sat down. I noticed his eyes flick briefly toward me, confusion written clearly across his face. Why was I here? Why was the general here? And why did the general seem to be running the entire conversation? General Caldwell folded his hands on the desk. "Major Collins," he said, "how long have you been assigned to this base?" "3 weeks, sir." "And before that?" "Camp Pendleton, sir." The general nodded slowly. "I see." He opened the folder in front of him. Several documents were neatly arranged inside. Personnel reports, inspection summaries, disciplinary notes, the kind of paperwork that quietly shapes a Marine's career. "Major," the general continued, "I've been reviewing your leadership record." Collins straightened slightly in his chair. "Thank you, sir. I take discipline very seriously." General Caldwell looked up. "That much is clear." The room fell silent. The general slid one paper across the desk. "Do you recognize this report?" Collins looked down. It was the disciplinary note placed in my file. "Yes, sir," he said carefully. "A supply discrepancy." General Caldwell leaned back slightly. "A numbering typo." Collins nodded. "Yes, sir." "Do you believe that error required a permanent record entry?" Collins hesitated. "Accuracy is essential in the Marine Corps, sir." The general didn't respond immediately. Instead, he picked up another document. "And these reports?" He placed 2 more papers on the desk. 2 other Marines from our unit. Both had received similar disciplinary notes. Small mistakes, clerical errors, nothing operational, nothing dangerous. Collins cleared his throat. "I maintain high standards, sir." General Caldwell nodded once. "Yes, I believe you do." He closed the folder. Then he spoke in the same calm voice. "Major Collins, leadership is not about how many mistakes you document. It's about how many Marines you help succeed." Collins shifted slightly in his chair. "Sir, discipline is—" The general raised a hand gently, not angrily, just enough to stop the sentence. "I've spent the last 2 weeks observing this base." The words hung in the air. "Quietly." Collins's expression changed. "You were here earlier, sir?" "Yes." The general's eyes moved briefly toward me. "At a diner outside the base." For the first time, Collins looked genuinely confused. The general continued, "I prefer to observe leadership without introductions. That way I see how officers treat people when no one important is watching." The room was completely silent now. General Caldwell leaned forward slightly. "Major Collins, I've spoken to your Marines. I've reviewed your reports, and I've watched how your leadership affects this unit." Collins didn't say anything. The confidence he usually carried was gone. The general's voice remained calm. "Discipline is important, but leadership without respect becomes control." He slid the folder across the desk. "Effective immediately, Major Collins, you are relieved of operational command pending a full leadership review." The words landed heavily. Collins stared at the folder. "Sir?" My commanding officer spoke next. "Major, you will report to personnel review immediately." Collins looked around the room. The situation was clear. There was no argument to make. He stood slowly. "Yes, sir." He saluted. Then he turned and walked out of the office. The door closed behind him. For a moment, the room remained quiet. Then General Caldwell turned his attention back to me. "Corporal Carter?" "Yes, sir." "You handled yourself well today." "Thank you, sir." He studied me for a moment. "Your record shows consistent performance." He tapped the folder lightly. "Despite recent paperwork." I allowed myself a small breath. "Yes, sir." The general nodded. "Leadership is about character, and sometimes character shows itself in the smallest moments." Perrinot's readings, like a quiet dinner on a rainy night outside Norfolk, and a Marine who simply chose to do the right thing. My commanding officer smiled slightly. "Carter, you're dismissed." I stood. "Thank you, sir." I walked toward the door, but before I reached it, the general spoke again. "Corporal?" "Yes, sir." He gave a small nod. "Good Marines look out for each other." "Yes, sir."
Then I stepped out of the office and back into the hallway.
Sometimes the smallest acts of respect reveal the true character of a person. In the Marine Corps, rank may command authority, but character earns respect. And that rainy night at a small diner outside Norfolk proved something every Marine already knows. Good Marines always look out for each other.